He collapsed in his chair like something inside him had finally given out. Not dramatically. Not the way people fall in movies, clutching their chest and knocking things over. He just deflated. His shoulders dropped first, then his neck, then the rest of him, and he sat there staring at the charred pages in my hand with an expression I had never seen on his face in the 12 years I had known him. It was not anger. It was not shame, exactly. It was something closer to the look a person gets when they realize, all at once, that the version of themselves they have been performing for years has just been seen through completely. My son was still smiling. That is the part people always ask about when I tell this story. Not what was on page 47. Not what happened next. They ask about the smile. They want to know how an 8-year-old sits at a family dinner table and watches his journal burn and does not cry, does not scream, does not even flinch. They want to know what kind of child does that. I want to know too, honestly. I am still figuring out who I raised. But I think the answer is simpler than people want it to be. He smiled because he already knew. He had known for longer than I gave him credit for, which is a thing children do and which adults forget completely. He had watched me for 2 years, moving quietly through rooms where I was not supposed to be anything important, and somewhere in that watching, he had learned something I spent a long time learning myself. Patience is not the same thing as weakness. And the people who mistake it for weakness always show you exactly who they are before you need them to. Some people in my family still believe I went too far with what happened next. I need you to tell me if they are right. The dining room was warm that night in a way that felt deliberate. His wife, Renata Chow, had lit candles down the center of the table, the kind that cost more than my first week of groceries when I moved to the city, and she had placed them at intervals that I recognized from a home decor account she followed obsessively. The chandelier above us was dimmed to what she called a dinner setting. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric I could not name but knew was expensive, because in this house, everything was expensive in ways designed to be noticed without being mentioned. My husband, Daniel Ferreira, was seated across from me, which was unusual. We almost always sat beside each other at family dinners, a habit we had built early in our marriage because it made it easier to leave together without making a production of it. Tonight he had been placed across from me by a seating arrangement Renata had sent by message the afternoon before, with a diagram. I had stared at that diagram for a long time. My son, Theo, was seated to my left. He is 8 years old, with Daniel's eyes and my grandmother's stubbornness, and he had brought his journal to dinner because he brings it everywhere. It is a blue hardcover notebook with a brass clasp, the kind I ordered for him after his school therapist, Dr. Amara Osai, suggested journaling as a way to help him process the anxiety he had been working through since 2nd grade. He had filled almost the entire thing by January. He had set it on the table beside his bread plate, the way children set things beside them that they want to keep close. I noticed Daniel's uncle, Hector Bravo, looking at it from across the table. I noticed because I had learned, over 12 years of family dinners, to notice everything Hector looked at with that particular expression. The one that meant he had decided something was beneath him and wanted someone else to know it too. Let me tell you how we got here. I met Daniel at a fundraiser for a community legal clinic in the spring, 12 years ago. He was there because his firm had donated table space. I was there because I had done pro bono intake interviews every 3rd Saturday for 2 years, and the clinic director had invited me as a guest. We talked for 40 minutes about a zoning dispute I found genuinely interesting and he found, I think, genuinely surprising, and by the end of the evening he had asked for my number with the kind of directness I appreciated, because it meant I did not have to interpret anything. His family, I understood early, was a different project entirely. Hector Bravo is Daniel's uncle on his mother's side. He is 61 years old, built like a man who played competitive tennis in his 30s and never quite stopped believing he still could, and he founded a mid-sized construction and real estate development company called Bravo Group roughly 22 years ago. By the time I entered the picture, Hector had become the gravitational center of the Ferreira Bravo family, the one who hosted Easter and Christmas and the occasional dinner that was not technically an occasion, but was always treated like one, the one whose opinions about careers and money and the correct way to raise children were delivered as observation and received as verdict. He had built something real. I want to say that clearly, because what comes later is not about whether he had earned his position. He had. He had worked hard in an industry that is genuinely difficult, and he had turned a regional operation into something with a portfolio that included commercial properties across 4 cities and a residential development arm that had delivered real value to real communities. I knew this because I had reviewed his company's public filings early in my relationship with Daniel, the way I review anything I need to understand, and the numbers told a coherent story of a man who understood leverage and timing and how to read a market cycle. What he had not built, and what he could not seem to stop trying to compensate for, was a son. He had 2 daughters, Celeste and Pillar, both of whom had married well and produced grandchildren who were satisfactorily photogenic and appropriately impressed by him. But Hector had wanted a son to hand the company to, in the direct, uncomplicated way he believed companies should be handed down, and that had not happened, and somewhere in the years of not having it, he had transferred a portion of that want onto Daniel. My husband became, in Hector's framing, the heir apparent. Not official. Not legal, but understood. The problem was that Daniel did not want it. He was a corporate attorney with a practice he had built himself, a reputation in his field that had nothing to do with his uncle, and a genuine lack of interest in construction management. He had told Hector this in versions ranging from polite to direct over many years. Hector had continued not hearing it, in the way that men like Hector do not hear things that conflict with the story they have already decided is true. I was introduced to this family as Daniel's girlfriend at a barbecue in the July of the year we began dating. I drove there in a used sedan I had bought the previous winter, which was the car I could afford and which ran reliably, and I wore a sundress I had owned for 3 years, which was the dress I liked and which still looked good. I was 31. I was a real estate attorney, recently made partner at a firm that handled commercial transactions across the northeastern corridor, and I had a client portfolio I had spent 7 years building through work that was genuinely unglamorous and genuinely mine. None of that was visible to Hector Bravo in the first 20 minutes. What was visible was the used car, the 3-year-old dress, and the fact that I had arrived without the particular social signals his daughters-in-law had arrived with, the specific brands, the specific accessories, the specific way of holding a glass that communicates a certain kind of belonging. "Daniel tells me you're in law," he said, handing me a drink I had not asked for. "Real estate transactions, mostly," I told him. "Residential, commercial, development deals primarily. Acquisitions." He nodded the way people nod when they are not really listening. "Good field for a young woman, steady work." I looked at him over the rim of the glass. I smiled. I said nothing. That night, I went home and opened my laptop and reviewed a pending acquisition file I had been sitting with for 2 weeks. It was a commercial property in a neighboring city, a warehouse conversion, 43 units of mixed-use space in a neighborhood that 3 years later would be exactly as valuable as I knew it would be when I looked at the demographic data in that review. I forwarded my recommendation to the client with a clean summary, closed the laptop, and went to sleep. It was the first time I made a choice about how to operate in that family. It would not be the last. The pattern established itself quickly, and I want to be precise about this because it matters to everything that came after. The underestimation was not malicious in the beginning. It was more structural than that. Hector had a framework for the world that had worked for him, and in that framework, women who drove modest cars and worked in law without announcing their earnings were people who needed guidance. He offered guidance generously and continuously and without invitation, and the guidance was always, in some version, the same: I should think bigger. I should attach myself to something larger. I should understand that the real way to build stability was through the right connections, not through independent accumulation. He said this in different ways in different settings, and the settings were always family, which meant the audience was always family, which meant the message was always slightly public. At Thanksgiving, the year after Daniel and I married, Hector gave a speech after dinner about the importance of legacy. He looked at Daniel 3 times during it. He looked at me once, briefly, when he said the word partnership, in a way that made clear he did not mean a professional one. He meant I should be supporting Daniel's integration into Bravo Group. He meant that was my contribution to the family. I had closed a 7-figure acquisition 2 weeks before that dinner. Not my largest, but clean. Clean deal, clean title, clean structure. My client had called me to say thank you in a way people sometimes do when they mean it genuinely, and I had sat with that phone call for a moment before returning to the preparation I had been doing for the next one. I did not mention the acquisition at Thanksgiving. I had, by then, already made the decision that I would not be mentioning things to Hector Bravo unless they were relevant, not because I was ashamed of them. Because I had understood something about the dynamic. The moment I started performing my accomplishments for him, I would be playing a game by his rules on his terms, and I had not spent 7 years building a practice to play someone else's game. Daniel knew. That was what mattered. Daniel had been there for all of it, had watched me work, had seen the client calls and the late filings, and the specific, grinding pleasure I took in getting a complex transaction structured correctly. He understood what I did and why it mattered and how good I was at it, and his understanding was not contingent on his uncle's. I called my attorney, Diane Sokol, the following week, not because of Thanksgiving, because of something I had noticed in a document 3 months earlier and had been thinking about since. Diane is a family law and estate attorney I had met through a bar association committee 6 years before this story takes place. She is meticulous in a way I recognize as a professional virtue, and she does not offer reassurance she does not mean. I had originally consulted her about estate planning for Daniel and me, the kind of structural conversation you have when you are building something together and want to protect it correctly. But in the 3 months before I called her that November, I had been thinking about something specific. A real estate investment trust that Hector had mentioned, casually, twice. The second time he mentioned it, he used the word family. As in, it's a family vehicle for family assets. I did not ask him to clarify, because I was not ready to have that conversation yet. But I called Diane and I described what I had heard, and I asked her what kinds of structures typically used that language, and what exposure they could create for people who were adjacent to them through marriage. She told me to send her what I had, which was not much. But she also told me to keep listening. I kept listening. The second incident I want to tell you about happened at Theo's 6th birthday party, which we held at our house on a Saturday in March. Theo was 2 years from being the boy who sat at that dinner table with the burnt journal. He was 6, gap-toothed, and deeply invested in a dinosaur-themed cake he had helped design, and the party was small because he was, even then, a child who preferred depth to volume in his friendships. Hector came with Renata and their daughter Celeste, who had driven up from the city. Celeste is a pleasant woman who has spent enough years managing her father's moods that she has developed a kind of perpetual diplomatic expression, the smile that means she is tracking something but will not say what. I have always felt a complicated sympathy for Celeste. Hector arrived and moved through the party in the way he always moved through spaces, assessing. He looked at the yard, which we had landscaped the previous fall. He looked at the furniture on the patio, which was good but not ostentatious. He looked at the cake, and the decorations, and the other parents, and he made a series of small observations that were framed as compliments but functioned as measurements. Then he picked up the invitation from the kitchen counter, where a few had been stacked with extra programs from the party activities. He looked at the address printed at the top. "You're in this neighborhood now," he said. It was not a question. 4 years, I told him. "Real estate is good if you bought right." He set the invitation down. "Daniel got a good rate?" I looked at him. "I bought the house, Hector, before we were married." A small pause, not long. He recovered smoothly because he is a man who recovers smoothly. "Smart timing," he said, and moved toward the yard. I stood in the kitchen for one moment. The house was a property I had purchased on my own 7 years before that conversation, in a neighborhood that had appreciated substantially in the years since. It was in my name, held cleanly, a fact that was documented and unremarkable and entirely mine. I had purchased it after my 2nd year of partnership, using proceeds from a portfolio I had been building quietly since my late 20s, guided by a financial advisor named Charles Ito, who I had found through a professional referral and who had been structuring my accounts with the particular conservatism I preferred. Steady, diversified, growing. I had not told Hector any of this, because it was not his information to have. I went back to the party. I watched my son eat dinosaur cake with the focused seriousness he brings to things he loves. I watched Daniel laugh with his cousin about something I could not hear from across the yard. I thought about a call I needed to make Monday morning. Monday morning, I called Charles and asked him to update the beneficiary designations on 3 of my accounts. It was a routine thing I had been meaning to do for 2 months. But I did it that Monday. If you have ever been quietly counted out by someone who was supposed to see you clearly, You already know what that particular kind of stillness feels like. The one where you smile and stay in the room and say nothing because the room itself is information you are still collecting. The third incident is the one I want to be careful about because it involves something Hector said to Theo, and I want to be clear about how I handled it and why. Theo was 7. He had developed in the previous year a habit of writing things down, which Dr. Osa had encouraged and which I had encouraged too because it suited his particular kind of interior life. He was not a child who processed out loud. He was a child who watched and wrote and returned to things in his own time, which made him seem, to adults who did not know him well, like a child who was not paying attention. He was always paying attention. At Easter dinner at Hector's house, Theo had brought a small sketchbook he was using at the time, before he had the blue journal, and he was drawing quietly at the corner of the table while the adults talked. He was not disrupting anything. He was being exactly as present as 7-year-olds should be allowed to be at long dinners. Hector noticed him drawing and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "What are you always scribbling, kid? You should be listening to the grown-ups." Theo looked up. He considered the question with the seriousness he applied to most things. "I am listening," he said. "I just write down the parts I want to remember." There was a beat of something at the table. A few people smiled. Hector did not smile. He made a sound that was somewhere between dismissal and amusement and turned back to his conversation. I put my hand on Theo's shoulder. "You done eating?" I asked him quietly. "Almost," he said. "Take your time," I told him. I did not make a scene. I did not correct Hector in front of the table, because Theo was watching me and I had decided in the years of raising him that the most useful thing I could model for my son was not anger but composure. Controlled, purposeful, strategic composure. The kind that waits for the right moment and is not passive in the waiting. But we left earlier than we would have, and in the car on the way home, I told Theo clearly, "You are not scribbling nonsense. What you write matters. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, with the economy of language that was becoming his signature, "I know, Mom, he doesn't write things down." I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "That's why he forgets," Theo said. I did not say anything. I drove. But something settled in my chest that evening, and when I got home, I sent a message to Diane asking her to schedule a call for the following week. I had 3 things I wanted to talk through that I had been holding for months, and I was done holding them. What I have not told you yet, because the order matters, is what I found 14 months before that dinner with the burning journal. I found it in a document. I am a real estate attorney. Finding things in documents is my specific professional skill, the thing I do so often and so automatically that I sometimes do it in my personal life without intending to. I am always reading ownership structures and looking for what is underneath them, the actual architecture of who controls what and through which mechanism, and with what exposure. Daniel's family had given me, over the years, enough ambient information about Bravo Group that I had constructed a rough picture of the company's structure without meaning to. You cannot sit at 12 years of dinners with a man who talks about his business the way Hector talked about his and come away with nothing. I knew the company was family-held. I knew there had been a restructuring several years before I entered the picture. I knew there was a trust instrument somewhere, because Hector had mentioned a trust in the context of estate planning conversations more than once, and the way he mentioned it told me it had been structured before his daughters were adults. I knew, because I know how these things work, that the trust Hector described was almost certainly designed to pass Bravo Group to a male heir in the primary distribution line, which meant, depending on the instrument's language, it might pass to Daniel. Which meant, depending on other things I had not yet confirmed, it might carry obligations or liabilities that Daniel did not know about. That we did not know about. I had not gone looking for the document. I want to be clear about that. It came to me through a chain of entirely ordinary professional circumstances. A title search on an unrelated property in my firm's case, Load, turned up a recorded deed restriction that referenced Bravo Holdings, LLC, which was a subsidiary name I recognized from something Hector had mentioned at dinner the previous spring. The restriction was minor and unrelated to anything I was working on, but the cross-reference flagged the entity, and when I reviewed the public record attached to it, I found a filing I had not expected. It was a regulatory disclosure, filed with the state. Not hidden, publicly available to anyone who knew what they were looking at. I looked at it for a long time. Then I called Diane. She reviewed what I had sent her, and then she was quiet on the phone for a moment longer than she usually was. Diane is not a woman who is quiet for dramatic effect. When she is quiet, she is thinking. Nora, she said finally, I think you should come in. I went in on a Tuesday in October, 22 months before the dinner with the burning journal. I sat across from Diane in her office, and she walked me through what the filing suggested, which was not proof of anything, not yet, but which was consistent with a pattern she recognized from 3 prior cases she had handled involving family-held entities and informal asset transfers, and the particular kind of accounting that is not technically fraudulent until someone looks at the timing. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, she gave me a list of things to document and watch for, and told me that if what we suspected turned out to be accurate, we would need a forensic accountant before we could do anything formal. I knew exactly who to call. His name was Ronald Park. I had worked with him on 2 prior matters at my firm, both involving commercial disputes where financial records had been the central battleground, and I knew him to be someone who found things the way I found things, methodically, with full documentation, without embellishment. I called him on my way back to the office. He picked up on the second ring. Ronald, I said, I have a personal matter, off the firm's books. I need you to tell me if you have capacity. Tell me what you're looking at, he said. I told him enough. He had capacity. Everything I had built quietly, over 12 years of family dinners and strategic silences and documents reviewed in my car in the driveway because I did not want to bring the weight of it into the house, was now in motion. I had not planned for it to go this way, but I had always, in the back of the particular part of my mind that does not stop working, known it was possible. Theo was 6 when I made that call. He had not yet started writing in the blue journal. He was still drawing dinosaurs in a sketchbook at a table where a man told him to stop scribbling. By the time that man picked up the blue journal at dinner and called it nonsense and threw it into the fire, I had been ready for 14 months. He just did not know what was on page 47. Ronald Park worked the way I worked. Early in the morning, with a second coffee going cold beside the first, and without any visible interest in impressing anyone. He had an office in a converted building downtown that looked like nothing from the outside and functioned like a surgical suite on the inside. Clean surfaces. No clutter. A wall of filing that was organized in a way only he fully understood, which I respected because my own system looks the same to outsiders. The first time I sat across from him in that office after calling him about the Bravo Group matter, he reviewed the public filing I had brought, asked me 4 questions, and then put the document down with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who has trained himself not to react until he has thought all the way to the end of a thing. This is not a small problem, he said. I know. He looked at me steadily. How long have you been sitting with this? 14 months of suspicion, I told him. 3 weeks of documentation. He nodded once. Give me 60 days. I gave him 60 days. What Ronald found in those 60 days, and what he continued to build over the following months, was a picture of Bravo Group's financial history that was not visible from the public filings I had reviewed, but that became coherent when you looked at the right set of internal records, the ones that Ronald was able to access through channels that were entirely legitimate. Vendor contracts that had been filed as exhibits in unrelated litigation, depreciation schedules attached to permit applications in 2 of the cities where Bravo Group held commercial properties, and a pattern of intercompany transfers between Bravo Group and a holding entity called Bravo Holdings LLC that did not, on close examination, match the asset valuations that had been reported in a refinancing disclosure filed 7 years earlier. Ronald never used the word fraud in our conversations during that period, because he is a professional and professionals do not use that word until they have the documentation to support it. But he used the phrase, material discrepancy, 3 times in our second meeting, and by the 3rd meeting he had stopped qualifying his language. The discrepancy involved a real estate portfolio that Hector had transferred out of Bravo Group's primary, operating entity and into Bravo Holdings LLC over a period of approximately 4 years. The portfolio consisted of 7 commercial properties, the largest of which, a mixed-use building in a city 2 hours from where we lived, had been carried on Bravo Group's books at a value of approximately $1.8 million at the time of transfer. Ronald had found 3 independent appraisals, commissioned by lenders who were not connected to Hector, that placed the property's value during that same period at between $3.2 and $3.4 million. The difference between the book value and the market value, across the 7 properties in the transfer, was substantial enough that it changed the picture of what Bravo Group was worth at the time of the restructuring that had occurred 18 months before Daniel and I were married. The restructuring that had, according to documents Diane had located through the state filing system, reduced Daniel's indirect inheritance stake in the company from a percentage that would have been significant to a percentage that was nearly nominal. Daniel did not know this. That was the part I was still processing when Ronald called me on a Thursday afternoon in February with a question delivered in the particular flat tone he used when he had found something definitive. Nora. The holding entity has a second set of signatories. I pulled over. I was driving back from a client site visit when he called, and I pulled off a main road into a pharmacy parking lot and sat there with the engine running. Tell me, I said. He told me. The second set of signatories on Bravo Holdings LLC included a name I did not recognize. A property management company incorporated in a neighboring state, the registered agent of which was an attorney whose name I also did not recognize. But the physical address associated with the registered agent matched an address that appeared in one of the permit applications Ronald had reviewed. The address of a property that Hector Bravo had purchased in his personal name 3 years after the restructuring. Ronald was still talking, but I had gone somewhere very still inside my own thinking. The property purchased in Hector's personal name. 3 years after a restructuring that had extracted significant value from the entity that was supposed to pass, in part, to Daniel, through a holding company with an out-of-state registered agent whose office address matched a building that Hector privately owned. I thought about 12 years of dinner tables. I thought about the word family used to describe the investment vehicle. I thought about Theo at Easter, drawing in his sketchbook, being told to stop scribbling. Ronald, I said when he finished. I need you to write this up, clean and complete, nothing speculative. 2 weeks, he said. I called Diane from the same parking lot. She answered on the first ring, and I told her what Ronald had found, and she was quiet again in that particular thinking way she had, and then she said, I'm going to need you to come in with Daniel. I took a breath. Not yet. Another pause. Nora, I need to understand the full scope first. All of it, before he knows, because the moment he knows, Hector will know. And I need everything documented before that happens. She did not argue. She understood. She had worked in family law long enough to know that information is only protective when it is complete, and that incomplete information in a family dispute is not a warning shot, it is an invitation. All right, she told me, but you're carrying something heavy. I've been carrying it for a while. I had. The weight of it had changed texture over the months, from something sharp and anxious in the beginning to something that had settled into the particular density of a decision already made. I knew what I was building toward. I knew it would have consequences that went past the legal, past the financial, into the architecture of a family that Daniel loved even when it was difficult, which it almost always was. I was not moving toward it casually or with any pleasure. But Theo had written something in a journal. And before that, someone had told him his writing was nonsense. And before that, someone had spent 12 years watching my husband and deciding what he was worth and quietly arranging the machinery so that the decision stuck. I was not going to let that stand. The first close call came in March, 8 months before the dinner. We were at Celeste's house for her younger daughter's birthday, a casual afternoon gathering that had been relaxed in the way family gatherings are only relaxed when no one has a particular agenda. Hector had arrived already when we got there, stationed near the kitchen island with a glass of something amber-colored, and he had the look of a man who had been talking about business before we arrived and intended to continue. He caught me alone near the back of the kitchen, while Daniel was in the yard with the children. Celeste was somewhere in the house. Renata was arranging things on the patio table in the particular way she arranged things at every gathering, which required her full concentration. I've been meaning to ask you something, Hector said. His tone was conversational, the tone he used when things were not actually conversational. I turned toward him. Sure. He swirled the glass once. There's a property I've been watching. Commercial, good bones, needs repositioning. I thought about bringing in someone who knows transactions. He looked at me. You ever do consulting work outside the firm? I understood immediately. It was not an offer. It was a probe. He wanted to know whether I would be willing to step into an advisory role which would give him visibility into my professional network and, more importantly, my professional habits. It was the kind of offer that looks generous and functions as intelligence gathering. I have a non-compete through the firm, I told him. Which was true and broadly applicable enough that it closed the door without requiring specifics. He accepted this with a small nod. Smart, you want to protect your position. Always, I agreed. He moved back toward the yard. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, and then I found my phone and sent a message to Ronald. Flag anything in the Holdings LLC records that touches commercial repositioning. Third parties, advisors, anyone being brought in from outside. Ronald responded inside of 2 hours, with 3 names I had not seen before. The close call had moved the work forward by 3 weeks. The second close call was harder. It was a Sunday in June, the kind of warm evening that makes outdoor dinners feel like an occasion even when they are not supposed to be. And Hector had hosted what Renata described in the invitation as a casual summer gathering, which in practice meant 17 people at a long table on the Bravo property's rear terrace and a catered setup that cost more than casual suggests. Theo was there, seated between Daniel and Celeste's older daughter, who was 12 and had decided she liked him because he was quiet in a way she seemed to find restful. He had his journal. He always had his journal by then. The moment came after dinner, during the part of the evening when conversations had split and Daniel had wandered to the far end of the table to talk with Hector's son-in-law about something involving local politics. I was speaking with Celeste's husband, a man named Owen Chow who worked in insurance underwriting and who I genuinely liked because he did not perform and was always exactly where you expected to find him in a room. Renata came and sat across from me with the particular precision of someone who has chosen a moment. She had a way of opening conversations that made them feel like they had been going on for longer than they had. She said, without preamble, "Hector mentioned you were looking at some investment properties." I kept my expression easy. He must have misremembered. We talked about a consulting question. "Oh," she smoothed the fabric of the tablecloth in front of her. "He thought you might be looking to move some assets around, consolidate." A brief pause. He mentioned that if you and Daniel wanted to discuss folding something into the family structure, there might be room for that conversation. The offer was being made through Renata, which meant it was not impulsive. It had been discussed between them before this evening. The language, folding something into the family structure, was precise in the specific way that imprecise language is never precise. They wanted to know what I had, and they wanted to position a merger as a gift. I looked at Renata with the genuine warmth I felt toward her in the moments when I could separate her from the situation she was embedded in. She was not a malicious woman. She was a woman who had built her security inside a specific structure and who defended that structure the way people defend the things they cannot afford to lose. "That's a kind thought," I told her. "Daniel and I keep our finances pretty simple, not much to consolidate." She smiled. Owen changed the subject to something about his daughter's soccer schedule, and the moment passed. I went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for 45 seconds, which is how long it takes me to fully slow my heart rate when something has come closer than it was supposed to. Then I went back to the table and sat beside Theo and looked at what he was drawing in the journal, which was a map of something, a made-up city with streets that had names he had invented, and I put my hand on his shoulder and he leaned into it slightly without looking up. The following morning, I called Diane before 8. "They're fishing," I told her. Her voice was level. "For what?" "Assets, mine specifically. They want to know if there's something to absorb before anything becomes formal." A beat. "That tells us they know something is coming. Or they suspect." I paused. "Either way, it changes the timeline. How much do you have left to document?" "Ronald needs 4 more weeks on the Holdings LLC transfers, maybe 6. "Then we hold," she said. "But Nora, I want you to do something for me this week." I waited. "Call your financial advisor," she told me. "Make sure everything with clear title is organized in your name, cleanly and without ambiguity. I don't want anything reachable if someone decides to get creative before we're ready." I called Charles Ito that afternoon. He is careful by nature and precise by training, and he had been managing my accounts with the kind of attentive conservatism that never becomes complacency. I explained the situation in the broad terms I could use without disclosing things I was not ready to disclose, and he confirmed that the accounts were titled correctly, and that the trust instrument we had established for Theo's benefit 4 years earlier, with Charles named as co-trustee alongside Diane, was clean and protected and entirely outside any exposure the Bravo Group situation could create. Theo's educational fund had grown to something I was proud of, not because of the number, though the number was strong, but because I had built it from the first year he was born, consistently, through the years when money was tighter and through the years when it was less tight, and it was his in a way that nothing could touch. "You're positioned well," Charles told me. "Whoever is looking at you from the outside is not going to find what they're looking for." "Good," I said. "I need them to keep not finding it for another 6 weeks." The third close call came from a direction I had not anticipated, which is the nature of the third close call. The first two are the ones you plan for. The third one teaches you something. It was a Tuesday evening in late August, 5 weeks before the dinner. Daniel came home from work later than usual, which was not uncommon, but he had a quality of quietness when he walked in that was different from his regular end-of-day quiet. He sat at the kitchen island while I finished the dinner I had been making, and for a few minutes he did not say anything, and I gave him the space because I know how to read the specific weight of his silences. Theo was upstairs, doing something with a building set he had been obsessed with for 2 weeks. I could hear the occasional click of pieces connecting. "Hector called me today," Daniel said finally. I set down the spatula. I turned around. His eyes were on the counter. "He wants to talk about the company. Formally, he said he's been thinking about succession and he wants to have a real conversation before the end of the year." I stayed where I was. I did not move toward him or away from him. I needed a second to understand which version of this conversation we were about to have. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." He looked up. "I know I've always said no, but he's getting older, Nora." He sounded different on the phone. Less like he was lobbying, and more like he was actually asking. I looked at my husband, who I love in the specific, complicated way you love someone you have built a life with, knowing all the places where that life has been harder than it looked from outside. I saw the thing in him that Hector had always known was there, the loyalty that could be activated by the right appeal at the right moment, the son feeling that had nowhere else to go. I made a decision in that moment that I want to be honest about, because I think it is the most morally complicated thing I did in this entire period. I decided not to tell him. Not yet. Not because I did not trust Daniel, but because I knew with absolute certainty what would happen if he walked into a meeting with Hector carrying partial information about what Ronald had found. He would telegraph it. Not intentionally. Daniel is not a man who conceals things with any fluency, which is one of the things I love about him, and it would have been visible in the conversation, and Hector would have moved, and the 12 months of careful, documented work would have collapsed into a dispute that happened on Hector's terms and timeline rather than ours. "Tell him you'll meet with him after the holidays," I said carefully. "That you want to come in with fresh perspective, not at the end of a quarter when everyone's distracted." Daniel considered this. "That's reasonable. It gives you time to think about what you actually want," I said, and that part was completely true. He nodded. He looked relieved in the way people look when they have been given permission to wait for something they were not ready for. I turned back to the stove. My hands were steady. That night, after Theo was in bed and Daniel had fallen asleep reading, I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on and sent Diane a message. "We need to accelerate. Give me a date for filing everything preliminary. I need to know we can move within 30 days. She responded at 6:43 the following morning. 30 days is tight. 21 might be possible. Call me at 9. I called her at 9. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, we had a date. Not a soft date, not a contingency date. A real one with Ronald's documentation incorporated, with Diane's filings structured, with everything in position. The date was 6 weeks out. The dinner was 5 weeks out. Hector moved the dinner up by a week, which I learned on a Saturday morning when Renata's invitation came through, and which meant that whatever Hector had planned for that evening, the timing was not coincidental. He was ready for something. He just did not know I had been ready for 14 months. Diane called me that same Saturday, after I had reviewed the invitation, and her voice carried the particular evenness of someone communicating something important without dramatizing it. "Everything is filed, Nora. We are ready whenever you are." I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the yard, where Theo had left his bike leaning against the fence the evening before, slightly crooked, one handle grip still visibly muddy from the trail he had taken it down on Thursday. Small evidence of a child who was out in the world and getting into things and making his mark on whatever surface would hold it. He had the blue journal with him at breakfast that morning. He was writing in it with the focused silence he brought to things that mattered to him, and I had watched him from across the table and thought about all the things he had written down in it over the months. The maps and the observations and the things he wanted to remember, because he had already understood, at 8 years old, that the people who do not write things down are the ones who forget. 5 days later, at a dinner table lit with Renata's candles, his uncle picked up that journal and called it nonsense and put it in the fire. And everything I had built across 14 months of silence was about to open in front of a room full of people who had absolutely no idea it existed. I want to know if you would have said what I said next, because I still think about it. The dinner invitation had specified 7 o'clock. Renata always specified 7 o'clock and expected arrival by 6:50, which the family understood and observed the way families observe unwritten rules that have never been discussed and never need to be. Daniel and I arrived at 6:52, which was as close to on time as the drive allowed, with Theo in the back seat, finishing a drawing he had started on the way and refusing to put the journal down until it was done. I had dressed for the evening in the particular way I dress for things that matter, simply, well, without announcement. A dark blouse I had owned for 3 years, good fabric, good cut. The kind of thing that does not photograph well and looks exactly right in person. I had learned early that the women in this family dressed to be noticed from across a room, and I had decided also early that I was not interested in being noticed from across a room. I was interested in being underestimated until the moment I chose to stop being underestimated, and the two goals require different wardrobes. Theo had the journal in his hand when we walked in. He always had the journal. This was as predictable as the 7 o'clock invitation, and no one in the family had ever commented on it beyond Hector's Easter remark 2 years earlier, which I had handled and which I had not forgotten. The house was full in the way Renata's dinners were always full. 17 people distributed across a space designed for 25, so that the rooms felt populated without feeling crowded, which was an effect Renata had perfected over years, and which I had to admit was genuinely impressive as a social management skill. Celeste was near the fireplace with her husband Owen. Hector's younger daughter Pilar was on the far couch with her husband, a quiet man named Garrett Solis who worked in municipal planning and who I had always liked because he asked questions and then listened to the answers. Daniel's mother, Lucia Ferreira, who was Hector's sister and the only person in the room I felt a completely uncomplicated warmth toward, was in the kitchen helping with something she had not been asked to help with and would not be deterred from helping with, which was exactly who she was. Lucia had come to this country with her husband, Daniel's father, 34 years ago, and she had worked as a seamstress for 11 of those years, while Daniel's father drove a delivery route, and she had watched her brother build Bravo Group with the particular mixture of pride and unease that people feel when someone they love becomes powerful in ways they do not fully understand. She had never been unkind to me. She had also never been my advocate in any family room that contained Hector, which I had understood for a long time and had stopped being wounded by. Lucia's survival in this family had always depended on not choosing sides openly, and I could not fault her for a strategy she had been running for 6 decades. The reason none of them had intervened over the years, the reason the dinner table comments and the dismissals and the small, deliberate diminishments had continued without any of the bystanders stepping forward, was not cruelty on their part. It was the same reason most families do not intervene. The intervention would have cost them something. Celeste would have lost the delicate equilibrium she maintained with her father. Owen would have stepped into a conflict that was not his to enter as a son-in-law. Lucia would have fractured the peace she had spent a lifetime constructing. And Pilar, who was the sweetest of them and the least equipped for confrontation, simply did not have the architecture for it. She saw things and felt them and then looked away, because looking away was what she had been taught was grace. I had understood all of this. I had never expected rescue. I had brought my own. The first 40 minutes of the dinner were exactly what 40 minutes of this family's dinners always were. Wine was poured, food was presented and admired. Hector made 2 observations about the local economy that were framed as conversation and functioned as monologue, and Daniel navigated the evening with the specific, practiced ease of a man who has been doing this for his entire adult life and has made peace with most of it. Theo sat to my left. He ate his bread in the methodical way. He ate things he was not particularly excited about, which meant he was thinking about something else. The journal was on the table beside his bread plate, which I had seen when we sat down and had noted without commentary. I want to be honest about what I was feeling during those 40 minutes. I was not calm in the way that people describe calm when they mean numb. I was calm in the way I am calm when I know exactly what I am doing and have prepared for every contingency I could identify, and have accepted that the contingencies I could not identify are simply the price of being in the room. My heart was moving at a slightly elevated rate. My hands were still. I ate the first course and listened to the conversation and watched Hector in my peripheral vision because I had learned over 12 years to watch him the way you watch weather. Not anxiously, but attentively, so you know what's coming before it arrives. He had been watching the journal since we sat down. I saw it the first time when Pillar was telling a story about her younger daughter's school play, something Hector was tolerating politely but not genuinely following. His gaze moved to the journal on the table, held there for a moment, and then returned to Pillar. It moved there again 10 minutes later when the conversation shifted and there was a natural lull, a beat where people were refilling glasses and finding their way to the next topic. He was building toward something. I did not know exactly what form it would take, because Hector's dismissals were sometimes verbal and sometimes gestural, and sometimes simply the pointed absence of acknowledgement. I had seen all three versions over the years. What he did was worse than any of them. He reached across the table and picked up the journal, not asked for it, not gestured at it. Reached across and took it from beside Theo's bread plate with the particular casualness of a man who has never questioned his right to touch things in a room. Theo looked up immediately. His face did not change expression, but his eyes tracked the journal with the specific attention of a child who has felt something important leave his hands. Hector flipped through it, not carefully. The pages turned with the rough efficiency of someone who has already decided what they will find and is looking only to confirm it. He went through perhaps a third of the book, glancing at whatever was on each page with the brief, dismissive attention of someone processing something that does not interest them. Then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh, exactly. It was worse than mean, it was comfortable. The laugh of a man who finds something amusing without feeling any particular need to care about the effect of his amusement. This is nonsense, kid. He looked at Theo over the top of the journal. What is all this? The table had quieted. Not completely, not dramatically, but the way tables quiet when something has happened that people are deciding how to categorize. Theo looked at him. He did not answer. Hector held the journal up slightly, showing the open page to no one in particular, and then his gaze moved to the fireplace. The fireplace that was lit because it was October and Renata kept the house at a temperature that required it, and which held a fire that was real and functional and approximately 3 feet from where Hector was seated at the head of the table. I saw it before it happened. I saw the thought form in his face. He tossed the journal into the fireplace. Not threw it exactly. Tossed it with the same casual motion you toss a paper napkin, a small disposal of something that does not matter, and the journal hit the lower edge of the grate and fell into the fire with a sound that was almost nothing, and the pages caught in approximately 4 seconds, because paper is paper and fire is fire, and there is no version of that equation where the paper wins. Theo watched it. He did not make a sound. He did not reach for it. He turned his head and looked at the fire for exactly the length of time it took to understand that the journal was gone, and then he turned and looked at me, and he was smiling. It was the quietest, most knowing smile I have ever seen on a child's face. It did not reach his eyes in the way happiness reaches eyes. It reached them in the way certainty does. He leaned toward me. His voice was low, the way he made it low when he was telling me something he had been keeping for the right moment. Dad, he doesn't know what I wrote on page 47. He meant Daniel. He always called Daniel Dad. In the moment, everyone at the table who heard it assumed he was confused about who he was speaking to. That was fine. The message was for me. I stood up, not slowly, not with the deliberate drama of a practiced movement. I stood up with the directness of someone who has been waiting for a specific permission and who has just received it. "Excuse me," I said to the table, and I went to the fireplace. The journal was burning along the bottom left corner, the pages fanning and curling in the heat. The brass clasp had saved approximately the right third of the book from the initial contact with the grate. I used the fireplace poker, which was hanging on the stand 2 feet from where Hector was sitting, and I moved the journal out of the direct flame onto the stone lip of the hearth. The damage was significant. but page 47 was in the middle of the journal. The fire had not reached it yet. I lifted the journal from the stone lip with my bare hand, which was not careful or comfortable, but which I did without hesitation, and I carried the charred thing back to my place at the table and set it on the white tablecloth, where it left a black mark, and I opened it to page 47. The table was completely still now. Hector was watching me with an expression that had not yet finished deciding what it was. He had expected a reaction, I think. He had perhaps expected Daniel to intervene, or me to be upset, or some version of the emotional response that he had learned over 12 years to expect from a room when he did something. He had not expected the poker. He had not expected the calm. I looked at page 47. Theo had written, in the large, careful print of a child who takes his writing seriously, "Uncle's company is built on money that he moved when nobody was watching. Mom knows. She's been keeping it safe." I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked up at Hector. The table was watching me, all of it. Lucia with her hands clasped in front of her, very still. Celeste with her fork halfway to her plate, suspended. Owen beside her, already understanding from my expression that something was happening that was not a dinner party thing. Pillar with her hand on her husband Garrett's arm. Daniel at the other end of the table, his face open and confused in the way of a man who loves both his uncle and his wife, and cannot yet see what is about to happen between them. I reached into the inside pocket of the jacket I had hung on my chair when we sat down. I had put it there before we left the house. I had known, not specifically, not with certainty about the journal, but with the general knowledge of someone who has been reading weather for 14 months, that tonight was the night. I set the envelope on the table. It was not a dramatic envelope. It was a standard legal envelope, cream-colored, with Diane Sokol's office return address in the upper left corner. Diane had sent it by courier the morning after she called to tell me everything was filed. I had kept it sealed until that afternoon, when I had opened it in my car in Renata's driveway, read what was inside one final time, and placed it in my jacket pocket. Hector looked at the envelope. Something in his face moved, not dramatically. Like a small structural thing had shifted underneath the surface. "Nora," Daniel said from the other end of the table, his voice was careful. "What is happening? I want to know if you would have answered him the way I answered him. I have thought about it many times since." "I'm going to tell you something that I should have told you a year ago," I said, "and I'm sorry for the timing, but I need Hector to be in the room when you hear it." I had imagined this moment many ways during the 14 months of preparation. I had imagined it going badly, going sideways, getting interrupted by someone trying to manage the temperature of the room before the temperature needed to be what it needed to be. I had imagined Hector talking over me, which he was good at. I had imagined Daniel shutting down, which was his response to family stress, the particular internal closing he did when things became too much too fast. What I had not imagined was the specific quality of the silence that followed what I said to Daniel. It was not the silence of a room that does not know what to do. It was the silence of a room that has understood all at once that the evening has fundamentally changed and that whatever comes next is going to be true. Hector recovered first. He was always fastest at recovery. This is not the time for. It's exactly the time. I did not raise my voice. I turned the envelope to face the table and opened the flap and removed the first document. "Hector, I want to start with something simple. Do you remember the restructuring you did with Bravo Group approximately 19 years ago?" A pause, controlled. "That's ancient history." "Some of it is." I set the document on the table. It was a copy of the state regulatory disclosure that Ronald had located through the public record. Some of it filed paperwork that is still very much current. Celeste's fork completed its journey to the plate, very quietly. Hector looked at the document from where he sat. He did not reach for it. "I'm not going to sit at my dinner table and be interrogated about my business." "You're not being interrogated." I kept my voice level, and even the voice I used in depositions when the other side was trying to establish a tone that didn't serve me. "I'm explaining something to my husband. You're welcome to listen." Daniel was looking at me with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to read me and finding the reading more difficult than usual. "Nora." "What is this about?" "The restructuring Hector did 19 years ago created a holding entity," I told him. "Bravo Holdings, LLC. That entity received a transfer of commercial properties from Bravo Group's primary operating account over a period of approximately 4 years. 7 properties in total. I turned to the second page of the document and pushed it slightly toward the center of the table. The properties were transferred at book value, which was, in the case of the largest asset, a mixed-use building that I won't name right now because it will come up again, approximately $1.8 million. I paused for exactly one beat. 3 independent appraisals conducted by lenders unconnected to Bravo Group valued that property during the same period at between $3.2 and $3.4 million. Hector's hand moved on the table, not toward the document. Away from it slightly, the way a person moves when they are resisting an instinct. "You're talking about internal accounting," he said. "That's standard practice for asset restructuring, completely legal." "It can be," I agreed, "depending on what happens next." Owen had turned in his chair so that he was facing me more directly. He was an insurance underwriter. He understood discrepancy analysis. I saw the moment he understood what I was describing, and he did not say anything. But his posture changed in a way that meant he was now listening with his professional brain rather than his family dinner brain. Pillar's hand tightened on Garrett's arm. Garrett was watching me with the patient attention of a man who works in municipal planning and has sat through many meetings where someone at the table knew something the room did not yet know. Restructuring also changed the inheritance distribution, I continued. Before the restructuring, Daniel's indirect stake in Bravo Group, through the provisions your father included in the original incorporation documents, was significant. After the restructuring, that stake became nominal. The restructuring happened without disclosure to Daniel and without disclosure to your father's estate, which at that point had been distributed, but which included language about the company's succession structure. I had practiced this part with Diane, not the facts, which I knew cold, but the order. The order mattered enormously. You give people a fact, then you give them a second fact, then you give them the relationship between the two facts, and you let the relationship do the work. Hector leaned back in his chair. The movement was controlled, but it was a defensive movement, the creation of physical distance dressed as confidence. "You've been doing research on my company." "I'm a real estate attorney," I told him. A public filing was cross-referenced in a title search on an unrelated property. The documentation is all public record. Daniel's voice came from the other end of the table, lower now, with the particular heaviness that meant he was absorbing something he had not expected to have to absorb. "Uncle Hector, is this true? It's a mischaracterization." Hector kept his eyes on me. "The restructuring was done for tax purposes, standard. My attorneys signed off on everything." They did. I reached into the envelope again. This is where it gets more specific. The second document was Ronald's summary. 41 pages, annotated, with the intercompany transfer records attached as exhibits. I did not put all 41 pages on the table. I put the summary page, which Ronald had written in the clean, declarative language he used when he had finished being careful and was ready to be clear. "My forensic accountant has been reviewing the Holdings LLC records for 11 months, I said. What he found was a pattern of transfers between Bravo Group and Bravo Holdings LLC that, taken together, represent a systematic undervaluation of assets prior to transfer. The total discrepancy across the 7 properties is approximately $4.6 million. If you are still here, hit like. I need you to have seen that number before what comes next." The number landed in the room the way large numbers land, not with noise, but with weight. The kind that changes the physical feeling of the air. Renata made a sound that was not quite a word. She stopped it before it became one. Hector did not look at Renata. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had pulled the poker from the fireplace stand, his expression was doing something I had not seen it do in 12 years. It was recalculating. $4.6 million, Daniel said. He was not asking for confirmation. He was saying it to make it real. Celeste spoke for the first time. Her voice was very careful, the diplomatic voice she used when she was managing something she did not yet have all the information about. "Nora, I think we should all take a breath before, Celeste." I looked at her directly, and I did not say it unkindly because I had nothing against Celeste and she had nothing against me. "I know this is hard, but I need to finish." She closed her mouth. She looked at her father. He did not look back at her. Daniel stood up. Not dramatically. He pushed his chair back and stood, and he walked to my end of the table and he stood beside me and looked at the documents, and he was quiet for a long moment. I watched him and I waited, because this was the moment I had been most uncertain about. Daniel is a corporate attorney. He could read what was in front of him, and I did not know exactly what he would do when he read it, because there are things you can prepare for and things that remain, until they happen, genuinely unknown. He picked up Ronald's summary page. He went through it slowly. He set it down. "How long have you known?" he asked me. "The filing came up 14 months ago," I told him. "I brought Ronald in 12 months ago. I didn't tell you because I needed complete documentation before anything went into a room with Hector." A pause. Something moved in his face that was not anger at me. I could see that clearly, but that was the close cousin of it, the version that shows up when someone you love has been carrying something alone. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I know." We looked at each other. That was the moment I mean when I say money is not the point of this story. The moment was not about $4.6 million. It was about a man and a woman who had built something together, standing at a table, with the evidence of what someone else had done to it, and finding that the weight was something they were both still willing to carry. Hector's voice came from the head of the table with an urgency that was new to it, the particular urgency of a man who has been watching a situation deteriorate and has decided that escalating is better than waiting. "Daniel. This woman has been conducting a covert investigation into my company for a year using documents she accessed through her firm. Think about what you're looking at." Daniel turned toward his uncle. He said, very quietly, "I'm looking at the numbers." Hector shifted forward. "Those numbers are out of context." The transfers were legal. The restructuring was fully compliant. If there are discrepancies, they are accounting artifacts from a period that predates current standards and can be explained by any competent CPA. "Then explain them," Daniel said. The room held that. Hector opened his mouth and then did not speak, which was the most telling thing he had done all evening. Hector Bravo was not a man who ran out of words. He had spent 61 years never running out of words. He ran out of them now. Lucia, from across the table, made a small sound, almost nothing, and covered her mouth with her hand. She did not look at her brother. She looked at her son. And in her face I saw the thing I had suspected she had known, or suspected, for a long time and had chosen to hold alone in the way she held most things. Quietly, internally, at a cost I was not positioned to calculate. "There's a third document," I said. Hector looked at me. Something behind his eyes had changed. The recalculation had finished, and what it had produced was not a strategy. It was something rower than that. "The registered agent for Bravo Holdings LLC has an office address," I said. "The address appears in a permit application from 8 years ago. The same address is associated with a commercial property purchased in Hector Bravo's personal name 3 years after the restructuring." I pushed the third document, the permit application with the address cross-referenced to the personal property deed, to the center of the table. "The property management company that operates as the registered agent for Bravo Holdings has been collecting management fees from the LLC since its incorporation. Those fees total approximately $840,000 over the life of the entity. The management company's single shareholder of record is Hector Bravo." The words were out, all of them. The complete picture, in the room, in front of everyone at the table. Garrett Solis, who had been sitting quietly for the entire dinner and who worked in municipal planning, and who had, I now understood, almost certainly seen versions of this kind of structure in his professional life, exhaled through his nose in a way that was not a reaction to me. It was a reaction to recognition. Owen's hand was on the table in front of him, very still, the way hands go still when their owner is thinking hard. Pillar had her face turned slightly away, not in denial, in the specific posture of someone who is processing grief they were not ready to process. Renata looked at Hector with an expression I had never seen on her face. It was not shock, exactly. It was the expression of a woman whose fear, long held and carefully managed, has just been confirmed. Hector pushed back from the table. The motion was abrupt, not violent, but it carried the force of a man whose body has decided before his mind has finished and who cannot stop it. He stood. He looked at me across the candles and the charred mark on the white tablecloth where the journal had rested. "You come into my house," he said. His voice was still controlled, but only barely, only by the thread of a lifetime of maintaining it in situations that required it. "You sit at my table, and you do this." I looked at him steadily. "You threw my son's journal into your fireplace." The sentence landed in the room. Simple, true, without elaboration. Hector's mouth opened. He was going to say something. I could see it forming, the justification or the deflection or the version of events that made it small, and then something happened that I had not prepared for and that I do not think he had expected either. Daniel said, in the voice he used when he had finished being diplomatic about something. "Sit down, Hector." Hector looked at his nephew. The nephew he had spent 12 years cultivating. The heir he had arranged the furniture of an entire company around, without, it turned out, actually including him in the structure. He sat down. He sat down in his chair at the head of his table in his house, and the movement had no theater in it, no performance of resignation or dignity. He sat down the way a very large thing settles when it is no longer held up by the thing that was holding it, and that was when he collapsed in his chair. Not medically. Not in the way that requires a phone call to emergency services. In the way I described at the beginning of this story, the shoulders first, then the neck, then the rest of him, the specific deflation of a structure that has lost its internal support. Celeste was watching her father with the expression of a woman who loves someone and has just seen them become something smaller than she needed them to be. There was grief in her face, and behind the grief there was something else, something I recognized because I had seen it in my own face in mirrors during the 14 months of preparation. Relief. The exhausting, ambivalent relief of a truth that has finally finished being a secret. Owen put his hand over his wife's. Garrett said quietly to no one in particular, "I think dinner is done." Daniel was standing beside me. His arm came around my shoulders, not a performance. The simple, reflexive motion of a man who reaches for his wife when the room is difficult, which is one of the things about him I have always loved without reservation. Theo, who had been sitting quietly to my left through all of it, looked up from the table where he had been sitting with the focused patience of a child who knew his part of the evening was already finished. "Can I have juice?" he asked. The question was so completely 8 years old that Lucia made a sound from across the table that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob and was probably both. "Yes," I told him. "Absolutely." I had one more thing to say. The one more thing I had to say was not about the money. Diane had told me months before that the moment people hear a large number, they stop processing. $4.6 million was in the room now, and it was doing exactly what large numbers do. It was taking up all the air, leaving people breathing around it rather than through it. Hector was sitting in his collapsed posture at the head of the table, and everyone else was arranged around the aftermath of the number like people standing near something that has fallen. I let the silence hold for the length of time it needed to. Then I reached into the envelope one final time. The last document was not Ronald's work. It was not a financial record or a transfer summary or a regulatory disclosure. It was a letter. 12 pages, drafted by Diane over 3 weeks, reviewed by a securities attorney she had brought in as a consultant, revised twice based on Ronald's final findings, and finalized the morning after Diane called to tell me everything was filed. It was addressed to Hector Bravo, personally, and to Bravo Group, the operating entity, and to Bravo Holdings LLC, all three, simultaneously. It was a formal demand letter. And attached to it, as Exhibit 1, was a copy of a complaint filed 4 days earlier with the State Attorney General's Office, Securities Division. I set it on the table. I did not push it toward Hector. I set it in the center, equidistant from everyone, the way you set something that belongs to the room rather than to any one person in it. "The complaint was filed on Tuesday," I said. "Diane Sokol is my attorney of record. Ronald Park is named as the forensic accountant who compiled the evidentiary record. The complaint alleges fraudulent conveyance in the transfer of assets from Bravo Group to Bravo Holdings LLC, breach of fiduciary duty to minority stakeholders in the original incorporation structure, and self-dealing through the management fee arrangement with the registered agent entity." Hector looked at the letter. He did not touch it. His voice, when it came, had lost the quality it always carried, the density of a man who occupies a room with confidence as a baseline condition. What was left was something thinner and less certain. "You filed a complaint 4 days ago, without telling me?" This was directed at Daniel. Daniel's arm was still around my shoulders. He did not move it. She didn't tell me either. "I'm finding out right now, same as you." Hector looked at his nephew for a long moment, and something happened in his face that I had not anticipated and that I want to be honest about because it complicates the story in a way that I think is true to what actually happened. He looked, briefly, genuinely wounded. Not in the performed way he sometimes performed disappointment, which was a management technique I had observed over many years. This was something else. This was the wound of a man who had told himself, for however long he had been telling himself the story, that what he had done was for the family. That the restructuring, the transfers, the management fees quietly accumulating in an entity he controlled, all of it was a version of stewardship that justified itself. He had believed his own justification. That was the humanizing thing, and it was also, in a strange way, the most damning thing. Because believing your own justification does not make the act different, it only makes the accounting internal rather than public. "I built that company," he said. His voice was low and without its usual architecture. "Everything in it, every brick, every contract, 30 years, and this is what happens at my dinner table." Celeste made a small sound. She was crying, quietly, with the contained economy of someone who has learned to cry without making it visible, which is its own kind of information about the family she grew up in. "You built something real," I told him, and I meant it. "But you changed what it was without telling the people it affected, including your nephew, including my husband." It was still going to him. The urgency was back in his voice, but it was defensive now, not attacking. "Eventually. The succession documents you have currently give Daniel a 4% stake in an entity that has already extracted the majority of the company's real asset value," I said. "Ronald's report documents this across 11 years of transfers. The current operating entity, Bravo Group proper, holds primarily contractual receivables and the company's debt load. The appreciated assets are in holdings, which you control entirely." The sentence ended. Owen Chow had his elbows on the table and his hands covering his mouth. He was an insurance underwriter. He understood asset structures. And I could see from his posture that he had understood, in the last 5 minutes, something about the financial reality of the family he had married into that he had not understood before. Garrett Solis cleared his throat. He looked at Pillar, who was looking at the table. Then he looked at me with the steady, measured expression of a man who processes difficult information professionally and has transferred that skill to this room. "Are we talking about criminal exposure?" "The Attorney General's office will determine that," I said. "Fraudulent conveyance at this scale, with this documentation, and with the self-dealing element established through the management fee structure, carries significant civil liability at minimum. The criminal question depends on intent, which is a matter for investigators." Hector's hand came down on the table, not a slam, a placement, deliberate, controlled, the last version of authority he had available. "I want my attorney on the phone." "That's your right," I said. "Diane's contact information is on the letter." Lucia, from across the table, spoke for the first time. Her voice was the voice she used when she was carrying something too heavy to carry silently anymore. She spoke in the direction of her brother rather than at him. "Hector, did you know what you were doing?" The room held. It was the question everyone had been sitting with for 20 minutes, and it was the only person in the room he might have answered honestly who had asked it. He looked at his sister. His jaw shifted. The silence stretched until it had told us everything the answer would have. Lucia folded her hands in front of her on the table and looked down at them and did not say anything else. Renata had not spoken since before the documents came out. She was sitting in her chair with the posture of a woman who is processing the distance between the story she has been living in and the story that has just been told about it. She was not crying. She was very, very still in the way of someone whose stillness is holding multiple things together by force of will. I looked at her. I did not feel triumph when I looked at her. I want to be honest about that. I felt the complicated, unwished-for sorrow of a woman who has had to do a necessary thing in a room full of people, some of whom did not deserve the collateral. "Renata," I said, "this was never about you." She looked at me. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them had tightened in a way that told me they would not be dry for much longer. She nodded once. It was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was not agreement. It was acknowledgement, which was the only thing available in that moment, and it was enough. Daniel spoke from beside me. His voice had the quality it gets when he has fully arrived inside a decision, when the attorney in him and the husband in him have stopped being two separate things. "Hector, I'm going to need you to engage counsel by Monday. Whatever happens through the Attorney General's process, there are going to be related proceedings, and I want them handled correctly. Not for your sake only, for the company, for the people who work for it." Hector looked at Daniel, his nephew, the person he had spent 12 years positioning and 12 years quietly cutting out. Something in the look between them was a conversation I was not part of and could not fully read, and I did not try to. That was between them. It had always been between them. Fine, Hector said. The word was flat and entirely without its usual ballast. Theo touched my arm. I looked down at him. He had finished his juice and was looking up at me with the practical, present expression of a child who has been very patient and would now like to go home. Mom, he said, can we leave? I put my hand over his. Yes, I told him. We're done here. My hands had stopped whatever they had been doing all evening. I had not noticed until that moment that I had been holding my breath somewhere in the back of my chest for the last 40 minutes. I let it out slowly, quietly, turned my face slightly away so no one would see it, and then I gathered the documents from the table and put them back in the envelope, and put the envelope in my jacket pocket. The charred journal I picked up last. It was cool now. The fire damage along the bottom left corner hardened into a black edge that crumbled slightly at the touch. Page 47 was intact. Page 47 was fine. I held the journal and looked at it for one moment. Then I handed it back to Theo, who tucked it under his arm with the matter-of-fact ownership of a child recovering something that was always his, and we walked out of that dining room together, the three of us, through the front door and into the October air that was clean and cold and full of the specific relief of a thing that has been finished. The formal proceedings with the State Attorney General's office took 11 months. The civil complaint, filed concurrently by Diane on Daniel's behalf, settled 8 months after that, before trial, after 3 rounds of mediation during which Hector's attorneys made 4 successive offers that were rejected before the 5th was accepted. The settlement required Bravo Holdings LLC to transfer 5 of the 7 commercial properties into a restructured entity, with Daniel as a named principal stakeholder, and required Hector to personally return $2.1 million, representing his proportionate share of the management fees collected over the life of the holdings entity. The terms of the settlement are confidential, which means I will not be reciting the final number, but I will say that Diane looked at me across the conference table when it was signed and said, with the restraint of a woman who has been practicing law for 26 years, "That's a good outcome." It was a good outcome. The Attorney General's investigation concluded 14 months after the complaint was filed. The office determined that the asset transfers constituted fraudulent conveyance under the state statute, and referred the matter to the Civil Enforcement Division. Hector was not criminally charged, because the investigation found insufficient evidence of the specific intent required for a criminal filing, a distinction that matters legally and which I have made peace with, because the civil consequences were real and the record is permanent. He paid a regulatory fine, the amount of which is public record, and Bravo Group was required to restate 4 years of financial disclosures and submit to a 2-year compliance audit. The company did not collapse. I want to say that because I know people will want to know. The operating business was real, the employees were real, the contracts and client relationships were real, and none of that was touched by the restructuring of the ownership and the financial restatement. What changed was who controlled what, and how the truth was recorded, and what Daniel's stake in the thing his family had built actually looked like on paper. Hector stepped back from day-to-day operations 18 months after the dinner. He retained a title and a ceremonial seat. He did not retain the same room. Renata sold 2 of the decorative pieces from the dining room that I had always found ostentatious and bought a place in a warmer city where she has, by Celeste's account, been gardening with a consistency that suggests she is happier at a smaller scale. I hope she is. I mean that without irony. Celeste and I do not have dinner together. But she called me 7 months after the settlement, on a Tuesday afternoon, and she talked for 22 minutes without me saying much, and at the end of it she said, "I think I knew something was wrong for a long time. I just didn't know what to do with it." I told her that was an honest thing to say. We have not spoken since, but the call happened, and it mattered, and I carry it as something real. Owen and Garrett know what they know. Neither of them has ever brought it up directly with me, which is probably the right call for everyone. Lucia came to our house for dinner 3 weeks after the evening at Hector's. She brought food she had made, the specific dishes she made when she wanted to say something she could not figure out how to say in words. She sat at our kitchen table and talked with Theo about his new journal, which I had ordered to replace the one that had burned, and she listened to him explain the map he was drawing in it with the full, genuine attention she had always given to the people she loved when no one was watching her give it. When she left, she held my face in her hands for a moment the way she held Daniel's face sometimes, and she did not say anything, and I did not need her to. Daniel and I are well. I know that is a simple thing to say, and that people want more complexity from it, but it is the true thing, and I have stopped dressing true things up to make them more interesting. We had hard conversations in the months after the dinner, about the year I kept from him, about what I should have shared sooner and why I didn't, about the weight of carrying something alone when you are theoretically building something together. The conversations were not easy and they were not fast. They took the time they took. We came out the other side of them knowing each other more completely than we had before, which is not always how these things go, and which I am grateful for every day in the practical, unromantic way you are grateful for things that required real work to keep. Thea started a new journal the week after the dinner. He filled the first page with a map of a city he called November, which he said was named after the month it was born in. He has been adding to it every week since. Dr. Osai says his anxiety has improved substantially over the past year, which she attributes in part to the journaling and in part to a stability at home that she can see in his affect and his engagement. He does not talk about what happened at the dinner. He is 8 years old. He processed it in the way 8-year-olds process things, which is to move through it and forward and not back, which is honestly a skill I am still working on myself. He still brings the journal everywhere. Last month at a school event, another child asked him what he was always writing. He looked up and thought about it the way he thinks about things. Things I want to remember, he said. And things other people are going to want to know later. I did not say anything. I just put my hand on his shoulder, the same way I always do, and he leaned into it slightly without looking up, the same way he always does. That was enough. That was exactly enough. So here is what I want to know, and I mean this genuinely. Hector lost the control he built over 30 years, and I put the complaint in before he ever knew it was coming. Some people in my family think I should have given him the chance to fix it privately before filing. My mother says a conversation would have been more humane. Did I go too far, or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.